Hello, this is Kofi, and here's a very short tutorial on how to use the new css-grid. What I'm trying to achieve is this design right here, which has three boxes that line up horizontally. Here's my HTML code. I have a div with an ID wrapper, an H1 with a title, and then these three divs correspond to the three boxes that are stacking horizontally. Here's what my design currently looks like. I haven't styled it at all. So let's start styling. So to begin with, I'm going to call my wrapper div, which is the parent. I'll give it a width of 600 pixels, a height of 400 pixels, and a background color of yellow. Refresh my design, and here's what I have. Next, I'm going to try and call out the three boxes. So I'll say dot cyan. I'm just going to give it a background color of cyan. Copy that, paste it twice, and I'll change the second one to magenta because I have a magenta class on the second box. Change the color to correspond to that, and then the last box was black, and I'll change the color to correspond to that. So as you can see, nothing shows up because divs by default do not carry any inherent information. You need to apply styles to them, and I haven't specified any dimensions for my boxes, which is why they are not showing up. So let's try and do that with css-grid. Now the way css-grid works is that it requires you to call a grid parent or a grid container, and then you need to include some child elements in that container. So in my HTML, I'm going to call it div and wrap it around the elements that I want to have stacking, which is these three elements. And I'm only doing that for purposes of this short demo, just to try and keep things simple. Obviously, if you want more elements in your grid, you're going to have to put more elements in it. So I'm only going to have these three divs in my to be using the css-grid method. So my parent div here, I'm going to give it a class called grid container. There's nothing magical about the name grid container. I'm only using it for semantic purposes. You can call it anything you want to. So in my CSS, let's start adding the css-grid method. So I'm going to call my grid parent grid container. Now the first thing you need to do to initialize that grid is to say display grid. Okay, and css-grid works by using columns and rows, and so you're going to need to specify how many columns your design has and how many rows your design includes. So in my design, I have three columns. Columns run vertically, and then one row. Okay, and you specify the columns by giving each column a width. All right, so there is a property that you use. It's called grid template columns, and then each column is going to have a corresponding width assigned to it. So the value here, I'm going to call this 200 pixels, 200 pixels, 200 pixels. Now let me explain what this is doing. So this means that I'm going to have three columns, and each of the columns is going to be 200 pixels wide. If I wanted to have four columns that are all 200 pixels wide, I could easily add another one. All right, so please observe that you do not specify the number of columns by just specifying a number. You specify it by declaring the widths of each column. Similarly, if you want to call out the rows, there is a property called grid template rows, and I'm going to give it a value of 200 pixels because I have only one row. And so I save this. Let's preview our design, and as you can see, everything is now stacking and lining up properly. Now, just to show you what I mean by how these columns and rows work, if I had just two values declared, I would have only two columns there. All right, and I could decide to make this 300 and 300 to fit in the parent, which is 600, and I can have that. Or I could preserve my three values and do something like 100, 300, and 200, which will still add up to 600, but they are varied widths at this point. Okay, so that's basically how the columns and the rows work. Now, the final property for this very basic tutorial is a property called grid gap, or to be specific, you can call a grid column gap or a grid row gap. All right, let's do grid column gap in this instance. So this is if you want to include spaces in your design. All right, so I call the grid column gap, and then I can specify the width or the amount of space that I want in there. So I'm just going to call 5 pixels, and when I refresh, you can see that it puts a space between the columns. Now you notice that my design, all these boxes have gone over the edge a little bit. The reason is because it's adding 5 pixels as gutters, which makes my final width 600, 200, 200, 200 plus 5 plus 5. So I end up having 620. So if I want to remedy that, I'll have to make sure that I am possibly doing maybe 190 on this one, and another, I can do 195 on this one, sorry, another 195, and that should get it to fit. But as you can see, this means that the boxes are not all even, and so you have to do the math to get it accurately. All right, or you can just adjust the parent to match accordingly. Okay, so I could keep these at 200 and then make this 610. All right, and it still fits. Okay, so I'll end it there. And like I said, this is a very basic tutorial on how to get started with CSS-grid. There are so many other cool properties that you can use. There is some documentation provided on the W3 School's website, and I will post another link in the description of this video for where you can find additional resources. Thank you.